The steam rising from the roast carried 27 years of Sunday dinners with it, every herb I'd rubbed into countless cuts of meat, every timer I'd set while my family gathered around tables I'd prepared. But standing there beside my daughter's dining room table, watching her gesture toward the kitchen with that practiced dismissive wave, I felt something shift inside my chest like a door finally finding its proper frame. "Mom, you'll eat after the guests are finished. There's not enough room at the table." The words hung in the air between us, competing with the scent of rosemary and thyme that still clung to my hands. 8 place settings. I had counted them twice while arranging the good china she'd requested I bring. 8 settings for 7 guests and my daughter. No 9th plate bearing my name, no chair pulled out in expectation of the woman who had spent her morning creating the centerpiece of this meal. I looked at the faces around the table, her husband's colleagues and their wives, people I'd met in passing at company functions where I'd been introduced as David's mother-in-law rather than Margaret, the woman who had taught literature for 34 years before retirement. They glanced up from their appetizers with the polite discomfort of witnesses to a family moment they hadn't expected to see. My daughter's eyes held that particular brand of impatience I'd grown to recognize over the past few years, the look that said I was being difficult when I should be grateful, demanding when I should be accommodating. The look reminded me I was lucky to be included at all. I reached for the roasting pan, my fingers finding the familiar weight of the ceramic dish I'd carried to countless gatherings. The metal serving spoon clinked against the sides as I lifted it, and for a moment, the dinner conversation paused. "What are you doing?" Sarah asked, her voice carrying that edge of embarrassment that comes when parents act unpredictably in front of the company. I met her gaze steadily, feeling a strange calm settle over me like a coat I'd forgotten I owned. "I'm taking my roast back home." The silence that followed felt different from the comfortable quiet of shared meals. This was the silence of boundaries being drawn in real time, of expectations crumbling like overbaked pastry. I lifted the dish and walked toward the front door, my footsteps steady on the hardwood floors I'd helped her choose when she and David first bought this house. Behind me, I heard David's voice attempting to smooth over the moment with something about my being tired lately, but I didn't pause to correct the narrative. I simply turned the brass doorknob, the same style I'd suggested during their renovation, and stepped into the October evening air. Respect cools faster than soup when left unattended. The thought came to me as I settled the roasting pan on my passenger seat and clicked my seatbelt into place. By the time I reached my own driveway 3 miles away, I realized I was not angry. I was, for the first time in years, completely awake. That night marked the beginning of a week that would reshape the landscape of my 73 years on this earth. 7 days during which I would return keys that were never truly mine, rewrite documents I'd signed in more trusting times, and plant lilac bushes in soil I'd prepared for my own tending. What began with a roast would expand into something I hadn't expected, the quiet revolution of a woman remembering her own worth. But revolutions, even quiet ones, require maps. And mine began with understanding how love had slowly, imperceptibly, transformed into obligation. I had not always been the woman who stood silently while others decided where she belonged. 27 years ago, when Sarah first placed my granddaughter Emma in my arms, I had been a woman with firm boundaries and a clear sense of self. I owned my own home, maintained my own schedule, and chose my own commitments with the same deliberation I brought to lesson planning. The shift happened gradually, the way shorelines change, one tide at a time, one small surrender after another. It began with babysitting requests that became expectations, with dinner invitations that transformed into cooking duties, and with financial emergencies that somehow became ongoing support without discussion of terms or gratitude. I remember the first time Sarah called me in tears about daycare costs. Emma was barely walking, David's promotion hadn't materialized as expected, and they needed help. Of course, I helped. What grandmother wouldn't? $50 here, $100 there, then monthly contributions that eased their burden and gave me a sense of purpose in retirement. The babysitting followed naturally. Tuesday evenings became my regular commitment so Sarah could attend her book club. Then, on Thursday afternoons, when David worked late. Then, on weekend evenings, they needed a couple of hours. My calendar, once marked with library volunteer shifts and neighborhood garden club meetings, gradually filled with their needs instead of my own. I told myself this was what family did. I told myself this was what love looked like, available, accommodating, always ready to step in where needed. I packed away my oil paints to make room for Emma's toys in my spare bedroom. I postponed the pottery classes I'd planned to take, knowing Tuesday evenings were now spoken for. I learned to check with Sarah before making any commitments, ensuring I wouldn't disappoint them if they needed me. The metamorphosis was so gradual I barely noticed it happening. One day, I was Margaret, the retired teacher, the woman who had commanded classrooms and served on curriculum committees. The next day, I was simply mom and grandma, defined entirely by my availability to others. The warning signs had been there for years, subtle as the fading of wallpaper in direct sunlight. The way David stopped asking if I needed help with groceries and started assuming I'd pick up items for their household while I was out. The way Sarah began sentences with "since you're not doing anything tomorrow," without actually asking what my plans might have been. The way my granddaughter, now 16, had learned to text me directly when she needed rides or lunch money was by bypassing her parents entirely. But it was the small moments that accumulated like dust in corners I'd stopped cleaning. The way conversations paused when I entered rooms, then resumed with careful editing. The way family decisions were discussed around me, rather than with me. The way my opinions became suggestions to be considered rather than insights to be valued. I had become a service provider in my own family story, valued for my utility rather than my personhood. And until that October evening, standing beside my daughter's dining table with my hands still fragrant with herbs I'd chosen and meat I'd prepared, I hadn't realized how completely I'd disappeared. The roast incident, as I came to think of it, was simply the moment the picture finally came into focus. All those years of accommodation had taught my family to expect my availability without reciprocating my dignity. I had trained them to treat me as optional rather than integral, helpful rather than honored. That night, after reheating a portion of my roast for a solitary dinner, I sat at my kitchen table and did something I hadn't done in years. I made a list. Not a grocery list or a task list or one of those careful tallies of what my family might need from me next week. This was different. On the back of a grocery receipt, I drew a line down the center and wrote two headings, things I owe on the left and things I don't on the right. The left column filled quickly. I owed Emma love, certainly. I owed Sarah and David respect and kindness. I owed my neighbors courtesy and my community whatever volunteer service I could reasonably provide. I owed myself honesty, health care, and the basic dignity of making my own choices about my time and resources. The right column proved more illuminating. I didn't owe anyone unlimited access to my savings account. I didn't owe anyone my entire Tuesday evenings for the rest of my life. I didn't owe anyone explanations for choosing to spend my retirement years pursuing my own interests rather than serving theirs. I didn't owe anyone my silence when they forgot to include me in their consideration. The rain had started while I wrote, a gentle October drizzle that blurred the streetlights outside my kitchen window. I could hear it tapping against the glass like Morse code, some urgent message I was finally ready to receive. The list grew longer as I continued writing, my handwriting growing smaller to fit more revelations onto the crinkled paper. I didn't owe anyone the pretense that disrespect was acceptable. I didn't owe anyone my compliance with arrangements that diminished my worth. I didn't owe anyone the exhausting performance of gratitude for treatment that fell short of basic courtesy. When I finished writing, I folded the paper carefully and placed it in the small wooden box where I kept important documents. Then I did something that surprised even me. I opened my laptop and began researching what it would take to make some changes. By midnight, I had bookmarked information about updating beneficiaries on financial accounts, changing powers of attorney, and establishing charitable trusts. I had also found a website for the community college's continuing education program and flagged 3 courses that caught my interest: watercolor painting, Italian for beginners, and small business entrepreneurship. What's written can be rewritten. The thought came to me as I closed the laptop and prepared for bed. For the first time in months, I felt the kind of tired that comes from productive work rather than emotional drain. The next morning, I called my bank and scheduled an appointment for Thursday afternoon. The First National Bank branch where I'd maintained accounts for 22 years occupied a corner building downtown, its brick facade softened by window boxes of late-blooming mums. I had always liked the way natural light filled the lobby, streaming through tall windows that reminded me of my old classroom. But on this particular Thursday, walking through those familiar doors felt like entering foreign territory. Mrs. Henderson, the receptionist smiled as I approached. "How can we help you today?" "I'd like to speak with someone about updating my account beneficiaries and reviewing my financial arrangements." The words came out more confidently than I'd expected, though my purse strap felt damp where my palm gripped it. 20 minutes later, I sat across from Patricia Chen, a woman perhaps my daughter's age whose manner conveyed competence without condescension. She had offered me coffee, asked after my comfort, and addressed me as Mrs. Henderson rather than dear or hon, small courtesies that felt significant after recent experiences. "What changes would you like to make today?" she asked, her pen poised over forms that would reshape my family's financial future. I explained my situation carefully, without emotion or elaborate justification. I wanted to remove my daughter as the primary beneficiary on my savings account and establish a more complex arrangement that would provide for Emma's education while directing the majority of my assets toward charitable purposes upon my death. Patricia listened without interruption, occasionally asking clarifying questions that demonstrated her attention to my goals rather than judgment about my motivations. When I finished explaining what I wanted, she nodded thoughtfully. "These changes are entirely within your rights," she said. "And I think we can structure things exactly as you described. The process will take about 2 weeks to complete, but we can begin the paperwork today." Something loosened in my chest, a tension I hadn't realized I'd been carrying. Here was a professional treating me like a competent adult capable of making informed decisions about my own money. Here was someone assuming I had every right to determine how my assets would be distributed. Here was the validation I'd been missing in my own family relationships. As we worked through the paperwork, Patricia asked questions that required me to articulate my values and priorities. What kind of educational support did I envision for my granddaughter? What charitable causes mattered most to me? How did I want to balance family provisions with community giving? Answering these questions reminded me of things I'd forgotten about myself. Yes, I cared deeply about education, but not just for Emma. I wanted to support literacy programs for adult learners. Yes, I wanted to provide for my family, but in ways that encouraged their independence rather than their dependence on me. Yes, I had strong opinions about how money should be used to strengthen communities rather than simply accumulate in individual accounts. "You've thought this through very carefully," Patricia observed as we finished the initial paperwork. "It's refreshing to work with someone who has such clear priorities." Dignity has compound interest. The phrase came to me as I signed the forms that would establish my new financial boundaries. Each signature felt like a small deposit in an account I'd been depleting for years through countless small surrenders. Walking out of the bank that afternoon, I noticed details I'd missed on my way in. The way the afternoon light cast geometric patterns through the lobby windows. The security guard nodded respectfully as I passed. The way my reflection in the glass doors showed a woman walking with her shoulders back and her chin level. I was halfway home when my phone rang. The caller ID showed Sarah's name, and for a moment, I considered letting it go to voicemail. But curiosity won out over caution, and I answered on the 4th ring. "Mom." Her voice carried a sharpness I recognized immediately. "We need to talk." "I'm listening." "David got a call from the bank." "Something about you changing your accounts? What's going on?" The storm clouds that had been gathering all afternoon chose that moment to release their first drops of rain against my windshield. I pulled into a parking space outside the library and turned off the engine, giving myself time to formulate a response that would be both honest and calm. "I updated some financial arrangements," I said finally. Nothing that affects your day-to-day life. Nothing that affects, Mom, you made me your beneficiary 5 years ago. We've planned around that. David's been counting on that money for Emma's college fund. The assumption in her voice, that my money was somehow already theirs, that my financial decisions should be made in service of their planning, might have triggered guilt or defensiveness in the past. Instead, I found myself studying the way rain collected and ran down my windshield in unpredictable patterns. Emma's education is still provided for, I said. I've established a fund specifically for that purpose. But what about the rest? Mom, that money could help us pay off the mortgage early. It could set us up for retirement. You can't just. I can't just what, Sarah? The silence stretched between us, punctuated only by the sound of rain growing heavier against the car roof. When she spoke again, her tone had shifted to the one she'd used as a teenager when accusations hadn't worked and manipulation was her next strategy. Mom, I don't understand why you're being so hurtful. After everything we've done for you, after how much we include you in our lives, this feels like punishment. What did we do wrong? Everything we've done for you. The phrase hung in the air like smoke from a fire I'd been too polite to acknowledge was burning. When my family's narrative shifted to cast their acceptance of my help as a favor they were doing me? When had my contributions become obligations that they were graciously allowing me to fulfill? This isn't about punishment, I said, my voice steady despite the emotional vertigo I felt. It's about making sure my resources are used in ways that align with my values. Your values? What about family values? What about taking care of the people who love you? The lightning that flashed across the sky at that moment seemed to illuminate something important. I thought about Tuesday evening dinners eaten standing in Sarah's kitchen while her family occupied the table. I thought about birthday celebrations where my gifts were noted, but my presence was taken for granted. I thought about Sunday afternoon phone calls that consisted entirely of lists of what I could do for them next week. Sarah, I said quietly, I need you to think about the last time you asked how I was feeling rather than telling me what you needed. Another silence, longer this time. When she spoke again, her voice carried the tremor of someone who was beginning to understand that the ground beneath a long-standing relationship had shifted. That's not fair. Of course, we care how you're feeling. We have so much going on. And you've always been so good at handling things yourself. So good at handling things myself. Translation, so reliable in my availability that they'd stopped considering whether I might need anything in return. So consistent in my support that they'd forgotten support was supposed to flow both directions. I am good at handling things myself, I agreed. Which is why I'm handling this situation myself as well. The call ended shortly after that, without resolution but without escalation either. I sat in the library parking lot as the storm intensified around me, feeling oddly peaceful despite the chaos of wind and rain against my car windows. Silence can be louder than accusation. The thought came to me as I watched people dash from their cars to the library entrance, their bodies bent against the wind. Sometimes, the most powerful response to unreasonable demands is the quiet refusal to engage with their premise. I waited until the worst of the storm passed before driving home, taking the long route through neighborhoods where I'd never lived but always admired. The rain had washed the October dust from everything, leaving colors more vivid and air that felt cleaner. By the time I pulled into my own driveway, I was already looking forward to whatever tomorrow might bring. The knock at my door came on Friday morning, gentle and unhurried in a way that immediately distinguished it from the urgent wrapping my family typically employed. Through the peephole, I saw my neighbor Elena Martinez, holding what appeared to be a covered plate. Elena had lived next door for 3 years, ever since her retirement from teaching high school English. We'd exchanged pleasantries over the backyard fence and helped each other with occasional package deliveries, but had never progressed to the kind of friendship that involved sitting in each other's kitchens. Until now. I made too many of these yesterday, she said when I opened the door, lifting the plate slightly. Cardamom cookies. My grandmother's recipe always yields enough for a small army. The scent that rose from the plate when she uncovered it carried hints of home and comfort, reminding me of the international potluck dinners we'd once hosted at the school where I used to teach. I hadn't realized how hungry I was for such simple, uncomplicated kindness. "Would you like to come in for tea?" I asked, stepping aside to welcome her into my front hallway. "I was hoping you'd ask." 20 minutes later, we sat at my kitchen table with steaming mugs of Earl Grey and a plate of cookies between us. Elena's presence filled my kitchen with something I'd been missing without knowing it, the easy companionship of another woman who understood the particular challenges of navigating family relationships in later life. "I couldn't help but notice you've had some intense phone conversations lately," she said after we'd covered the safe topics of weather and neighborhood happenings. "The walls between our houses are thinner than I'd like, and I've been concerned about you." Her directness was refreshing after years of family communication that relied heavily on subtext and assumption. I found myself explaining the recent changes I'd made, the bank appointment, and the difficult conversation with Sarah. Elena listened with the focused attention I remembered from my teaching days, the kind of listening that seeks understanding rather than simply waiting for a turn to speak. "Boundary setting with adult children," she said when I finished. "It's like trying to renegotiate a contract that the other party has never acknowledged existed." The metaphor was so apt I nearly laughed. Exactly. Somehow, I trained them to expect certain things without establishing mutual terms. "We all did," Elena said, reaching for another cookie. "It's what we were taught was good mothering. Be available, be helpful, and be grateful for whatever inclusion we receive. Don't make waves, don't have needs, and don't complicate their lives with our own desires for dignity and respect." She spoke with the weary wisdom of someone who had traveled similar territory. I learned that Elena had spent 5 years carefully extricating herself from a similar dynamic with her own daughter, who had assumed Elena's retirement would mean unlimited availability for babysitting and household help. The turning point came when my daughter actually said she didn't understand why I needed advance notice before keeping the grandchildren overnight, Elena recalled. As if my time had no value, as if I had no life beyond waiting for her convenience. "What did you do?" I started charging her. The words hung in the air between us while I processed their implications. Elena saw my expression and smiled. "Not a lot. $20 for emergency babysitting, $10 for running errands I hadn't planned to do. Not because I needed the money, but because payment implies respect for services rendered." It forced her to consider whether her requests were truly necessary or just convenient. The strategy was brilliant in its simplicity. By introducing a small financial exchange, Elena had transformed herself from an infinitely available resource into a person whose time had measurable value. Her daughter had to actively choose whether Elena's help was worth the cost, which naturally reduced frivolous requests. Did it work? Better than I expected. Not only did the requests decrease, but the ones that remained came with genuine appreciation. She started saying please and thank you again. She started asking about my schedule instead of announcing her needs. We talked until the afternoon light began to fade, sharing stories of our teaching years and our retirement adjustments. Elena told me about the gardening club she'd joined, the pottery classes she'd started, and the novel she'd been writing in small increments each morning. Her life sounded rich and self-directed in ways that made me realize how impoverished my own retirement had become. Before she left, Elena pressed something into my hands, a slim paperback book with a green cover. "Gardening for the Soul," the title read. "It's about creating spaces that feed you rather than drain you. I thought you might enjoy it." That evening, I made myself a simple dinner and settled into my reading chair with Elena's book. The first chapter discussed the difference between gardens designed for display and gardens designed for the gardener's joy. The author wrote about choosing plants that would thrive in your particular conditions rather than forcing growth in hostile environments. Healing sometimes tastes of cardamom. The thought came to me as I sipped the tea I'd made with leaves Elena had shared, my reading interrupted by the memory of her grandmother's cookies and the afternoon of companionship that had nourished something in me I'd forgotten needed tending. I fell asleep in my chair that night, the gardening book open in my lap, dreaming of lilac bushes and raised beds full of vegetables I would grow for my own table. The idea came to me gradually, like dawn breaking over a familiar landscape. I had been awake since 5:30, moving through my morning routine with unusual energy, when I realized I was humming. Not any particular song, just a wordless melody that seemed to rise from some place in my chest that had been quiet for too long. I was standing in my kitchen, measuring coffee and watching the sun paint geometric patterns across my countertops, when the scent of yesterday's cardamom cookies triggered a memory so vivid I had to sit down. I was 8 years old, standing on a step stool beside my grandmother's mixing bowl, learning to cream butter and sugar with a wooden spoon that was almost too heavy for my small hands. Baking is magic, she had told me, guiding my stirring with her weathered fingers over mine. You take simple things, flour, eggs, butter, and create something that feeds people's bodies and souls. I had loved baking then, before it became another item on the endless list of family obligations. Before, birthday cakes became expected rather than celebratory gifts. Before my kitchen became a service station rather than a place of creativity and joy. But sitting in the morning light, I remembered the particular satisfaction of pulling perfectly risen bread from the oven, the way cookie dough felt under my hands, and the pride of creating something beautiful and nourishing from basic ingredients. I remembered when baking was mine, a skill I developed for my own pleasure rather than everyone else's expectations. The business plan wrote itself over the course of 3 cups of coffee and 2 phone calls. First, I called the county clerk's office to ask about requirements for operating a small food business from home. Then I called my insurance agent to discuss liability coverage. By 10 o'clock, I had a folder full of information and a growing sense of excitement about a possibility I hadn't considered in years. Small-scale home baking operations, I learned, were entirely legal with proper permits and health department approval. I could sell at farmers markets, take custom orders for special occasions, and even supply local coffee shops with fresh goods. The startup costs were minimal since I already owned most of the necessary equipment. But more importantly, this would be mine. My schedule, my recipes, my customers, my income. Not family obligation disguised as gift-giving, but legitimate work that would provide both purpose and financial independence. I spent the afternoon clearing out my spare bedroom, the one that had gradually filled with Emma's outgrown toys, David's old computer equipment, and Sarah's overflow storage. Box by box, I reclaimed the space that would become my baking headquarters. The room had excellent morning light and a small sink I'd forgotten was there, perfect for a specialized work area. By evening, I had sketched a floor plan that would accommodate cooling racks, additional storage, and a small table where I could package orders. I had also started a list of possible product offerings, artisan breads, seasonal cookies, custom celebration cakes, and breakfast pastries for the coffee shop 2 blocks away. The next morning, I baked my first test batch, cinnamon rolls with a maple glaze recipe I'd been perfecting for 20 years. The process felt like meditation, my hands remembering rhythms they'd known long before baking became an obligation. Mixing, kneading, shaping, waiting, each step grounded me more firmly in the present moment. When Elena knocked at my door around noon, the kitchen still smelled of yeast and cinnamon and possibility. "Good heavens," she said, stepping inside and breathing deeply. "What's that incredible smell?" I led her to the kitchen, where 24 perfect cinnamon rolls cooled on wire racks. Her eyes widened with the kind of appreciation I hadn't seen directed toward my baking in years. "Margaret, these are gorgeous. They look professional." Professional. The word sent a small thrill through me. These weren't grandmother's obligatory treats or mother's expected contributions. These were products worthy of payment, goods that could support an independent life. "I'm thinking about starting a small business," I said, offering her a still warm roll on one of my good plates. "Home baking, custom orders, maybe some regular farmers market sales." Elena bit into the pastry and closed her eyes, making sounds of genuine appreciation that told me more about the quality than any professional review could have. When she opened her eyes, they were bright with excitement. Margaret, this is restaurant quality. You could charge premium prices for these. She paused, considering. Have you talked to Rosa at the coffee corner? She's been looking for a local supplier for breakfast pastries. The coffee corner was a small independent shop downtown, the kind of place that prided itself on supporting local artisans. I had been a customer there for years but had never considered myself a potential vendor. You think she'd be interested? I think she'd be thrilled. Especially if you can do seasonal offerings, maybe some gluten-free options. The market for high-quality local baking is stronger than you might think. That afternoon, Elena insisted on accompanying me to the coffee corner for what she called a reconnaissance mission. We sat at a corner table, sampling the current breakfast offerings while observing customer reactions and listening to conversations about food quality and local sourcing. Rosa herself was a woman in her 40s who moved through her shop with the confident grace of someone who had built something meaningful from nothing. When Elena introduced me as a neighbor with exceptional baking skills, Rosa's interest was immediate and genuine. I've been searching for a local baker for 2 years, she said, sliding into the empty chair at our table. Someone who can provide consistent quality without the industrial feel of wholesale suppliers. What kind of volume could you handle? We talked for an hour about products, scheduling, pricing, and logistics. Rosa was particularly excited about the possibility of seasonal offerings, pumpkin scones for fall, gingerbread muffins for winter, and lemon bars for spring. She also mentioned catering opportunities for business meetings and private events. By the time I left the coffee corner, I had a verbal agreement to provide sample products the following week and a potential contract that would generate more monthly income than I'd expected from twice as much work. Creation is quieter than revenge, and stronger. The thought came to me as I drove home, my head full of recipe possibilities and production schedules. Building something new from my own skills and vision felt infinitely more powerful than anything I could have done to punish my family for their lack of consideration. That evening, I called Sarah. Mom? Her voice carried surprise and residual wariness from our last conversation. I wanted to let you know I'm starting a small business, I said without preamble. Home baking, custom orders, and some regular commercial accounts. I'll be busier than usual for the next few weeks getting established. A business? Mom, are you sure that's? I mean, do you need help with the business side of things? David knows about taxes and permits and… Thank you, but I've already handled those details. Another pause. I could almost hear her recalibrating, trying to figure out how this new development fit into her understanding of me as someone who needed their guidance rather than someone capable of independent action. Well, she said finally, that sounds good. Are you doing this because you need money? Because if that's why you changed the accounts. I'm doing this because I want to, I said simply. Because I'm good at it, and because building something of my own feels like the right choice at this stage of my life. The conversation ended cordially but with an underlying tension that told me my family was still processing the reality of my newfound independence. They had grown accustomed to a version of me that existed primarily in relation to their needs. This new woman, the one making unilateral financial decisions, starting businesses, and setting boundaries, required an adjustment period. I was fine with that. Adjustment, I was learning, was a two-way street. 3 weeks later, I stood in the county clerk's office, signing the final papers that would establish the Lilac Trust, a charitable foundation dedicated to supporting community kitchens and food security programs. The trust would receive the majority of my assets upon my death, ensuring that the money I'd spent decades accumulating would continue feeding people long after I was gone. Patricia Chen from the bank had recommended the lawyer who helped me structure the trust, a younger woman named Jennifer Walsh who specialized in charitable giving and seemed to understand immediately what I hoped to accomplish. Jennifer had helped me craft language that would protect the trust's mission while providing flexibility for changing community needs. This is beautifully conceived, Jennifer said as I signed the incorporation documents. Food insecurity among seniors is such an overlooked issue, and community kitchens provide dignity along with nutrition. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was addressing hunger while my own family accused me of starving them of their expected inheritance. But this felt right in ways that simple estate planning never had. My money would continue the work I'd begun with countless meals prepared for others, feeding people who needed nourishment rather than those who simply expected it. The trust was structured to begin operations immediately with a modest initial contribution from my savings, growing gradually until my death triggered the larger transfer. This meant I could watch it work during my lifetime, making adjustments and enjoying the satisfaction of seeing my values made manifest in the world. The first grant would go to the downtown community kitchen where Elena volunteered, helping them expand their senior meal program. The second would support a new initiative providing cooking classes for low-income families. Both programs addressed food insecurity while building skills and community connections. I fed what once fed me, kindness. The phrase came to me as I walked out of the lawyer's office, the signed documents secure in my briefcase. All those years of cooking for family, neighbors, and community events had taught me something essential about the way food connects people across lines of difference and difficulty. Now my money would extend that connection far beyond what I could accomplish with my own hands. The autumn light felt different as I drove home, golden and substantial in ways that made ordinary buildings seem touched with grace. I had spent the morning making legal provisions for my death, but I felt more alive than I had in years. Purpose, I realized, was its own kind of nourishment. That evening, I called Emma. My granddaughter answered on the second ring, her voice carrying the slightly breathless quality that meant she was probably multitasking homework with social media. Grandma. Mom said you started a business? That's so cool. I did. Baking, mostly for coffee shops and special orders. It's been more successful than I expected. I love that you're doing something just for you, Emma said, and something in her tone made me pay closer attention. Sometimes I worry that you spend all your time doing things for other people. The observation was so perceptive, so exactly what I'd been learning about myself, that I had to pause before responding. At 16, Emma saw patterns that had taken me decades to recognize. I used to do that, I agreed. But I'm learning to balance caring for others with caring for myself. Good. You deserve to have your own thing, your own life. Not just being there whenever everyone else needs something. We talked for another 20 minutes about her school, her friends, and her own dreams for independence someday. Emma told me about the college applications she'd started, the scholarship essays she was writing, and the excitement and anxiety of planning her own future. Her conversation was full of agency and self-direction that reminded me of myself at her age, before I'd learned to shrink my ambitions to fit other people's comfort levels. Before hanging up, Emma said something that stayed with me through the evening. Grandma, I'm really proud of you for making changes. It shows me that it's never too late to choose yourself. Choose yourself. The phrase echoed in my mind as I prepared for bed, checking the locks and turning off lights in a house that felt more like home than it had in years. Emma's words carried permission I hadn't realized I'd been seeking, validation that self-respect wasn't selfish, that protecting my own interests wasn't a betrayal of family loyalty. That night, I dreamed of gardens full of lilacs, their purple blooms heavy with fragrance and meaning. The morning of the first farmer's market dawned clear and crisp, with the kind of October light that makes everything look touched by gold. I had been awake since 4:30, loading my car with wooden tables, folding chairs, and carefully packed boxes of baked goods. The nervous energy I felt reminded me of the first day of each new school year, anticipation mixed with purpose, excitement tempered by the healthy concern of someone about to test their skills in new territory. Elena had insisted on helping me set up, arriving at my house while I was still loading the last boxes of maple pecan scones and rosemary olive bread. Her presence steadied me in ways I hadn't expected, her easy confidence reminding me that I was good at this, that the quality of my work would speak for itself. You're going to be amazed by the response, she said as we drove toward the downtown market square. People are hungry for real food made by real people. You're offering something special. The farmer's market occupied a tree-lined square in the oldest part of downtown, surrounded by brick buildings that had housed businesses for more than a century. Tables covered with bright cloths displayed late-season vegetables, artisan crafts, fresh flowers, and specialty foods. The atmosphere hummed with the kind of community energy I'd forgotten existed, neighbors greeting neighbors, families sampling local honey, children learning the names of vegetables they'd only seen in grocery stores. My assigned space was between a vegetable farmer who'd been working the same land for 40 years and a young woman selling handmade soaps. Both welcomed me with the easy friendliness of people who understood the particular courage required to make a living from work you could touch and see. Within an hour of opening, I understood what Elena had meant about people being hungry for real food. Customers didn't just buy my bread and pastries, they asked questions about ingredients, shared memories of grandmothers who'd baked similar items, and requested custom orders for upcoming celebrations. Each transaction felt like a small conversation, a connection that went beyond simple commerce. Mrs. Patterson, who'd taught second grade at the elementary school where I'd once volunteered, bought 3 loaves of bread and told me she'd been searching for someone who made the kind of whole-grain bread her mother used to bake. Chen, whose family owned the hardware store, ordered 2 dozen cookies for his daughter's birthday party, specifying that he wanted something made with love, not machines. By noon, I had sold nearly everything I'd brought and had taken orders for the following week that would require me to double my production. More importantly, I had spent 4 hours in conversations that treated me as an artisan, an entrepreneur, and a woman with valuable skills and interesting stories to tell. The coffee shop partnership had also blossomed beyond my initial expectations. Rosa had been so pleased with my sample products that she'd increased her weekly order and asked me to develop seasonal specialties for the holiday months ahead. The steady income from commercial accounts, combined with farmers' market sales and custom orders, would provide enough money to live comfortably without drawing on my savings. But the financial success, gratifying as it was, mattered less than the restoration of something I'd lost without knowing it. I had work that fed my creativity and connected me with my community. I had reasons to get up early that had nothing to do with other people's needs. I had conversations throughout my week with people who saw me as Margaret the baker rather than just mom or grandma. Driving home that afternoon, my car empty of products and my mind full of next week's production plans, I realized I was humming again. Not the unconscious melody of recent weeks, but Here Comes the Sun, a song I hadn't thought of in years but that seemed to capture the particular quality of light I was moving through. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea and my order book, planning the next week's baking schedule. The work required more organization than I'd initially anticipated, tracking custom orders, managing inventory, scheduling delivery times, but each task felt purposeful in ways my previous routine had not. The knock at my door came just as I was finishing my planning session. Through the window, I could see David's car in my driveway, and my heart rate quickened slightly with the old anxiety of family confrontation. But when I opened the door, he stood alone on my front step, his posture carrying none of the aggressive energy I'd learned to expect from family visits. "Margaret," he said, using my first name instead of the mom that had always sounded slightly stiff in his voice. "Could we talk for a few minutes?" I invited him in, offering coffee that he declined in favor of sitting at my kitchen table, where the evidence of my new life spread across the surface: order forms, recipe cards, business license applications, and a calculator still showing profit margins from the day's sales. "Sarah told me about the bank changes," he said without preamble. "And I heard about your business from Emma." I wanted to. "I owe you an apology." The words hung in the air between us while I processed their implications. David had never apologized to me for anything in the 14 years he'd been part of our family. He'd thanked me, occasionally, for specific services rendered. He'd acknowledged my contributions when prompted. But he'd never voluntarily examined his own behavior and found it wanting. "We got comfortable," he continued, his eyes focused on his hands rather than my face. "With your help, with your availability. We started taking it for granted instead of appreciating it. And that dinner." He shook his head. "Sarah was embarrassed about the seating arrangements, but honestly, I was embarrassed that we'd gotten to the point where we thought that was acceptable. I listened without responding, curious about where this unexpected self-reflection would lead. "The thing is," David said, finally meeting my eyes, "I really respect what you're doing now. The business, the independence, the way you're building something that's entirely yours. Emma talks about you differently, like you're this role model for being brave enough to start over. And she's right. Repair begins where revenge would have started." The thought came to me as I watched my son-in-law struggle to articulate an understanding he was still developing. This conversation could have happened months ago if I'd demanded it, if I'd confronted them about their treatment and forced accountability. But it was happening now because my actions had created space for his reflection, because building my own life had been more powerful than fighting for recognition in theirs. "I appreciate you saying that," I said finally. "And I want you to know that none of this was done to hurt you or Sarah. It was done to take care of myself in ways I'd forgotten how to do." We talked for another 30 minutes, covering territory that felt both familiar and entirely new. David asked questions about my business plans, my charitable foundation, and my goals for this phase of my life. He shared concerns about Emma's college applications, updates about his work, and thoughts about retirement planning, which I can't assume my financial contribution. When he left, he paused at the door to say something that surprised me with its simple sincerity: "I hope we can find a better balance going forward. One that works for all of us, including you." That night, I fell asleep thinking about repair work, not the kind that fixes broken things back to their original condition, but the kind that creates something stronger and more honest from the pieces of what came before. The lilac bushes arrived on a Tuesday morning in late October, 6 small plants with root balls wrapped in burlap and hope. I had ordered them from a nursery Elena recommended, choosing varieties that would bloom in different shades of purple and white, creating a small forest of fragrance against my back fence. The salesman had tried to talk me out of fall planting, suggesting I wait until spring, when conditions would be more favorable for establishing new growth. But I wanted them in the ground now. I wanted to give them the winter months to develop strong roots before their first blooming season. Sometimes the best growth happens underground, during seasons that look like dormancy but are actually periods of deep preparation. Elena arrived as I was marking planting spots with small flags, carrying a thermos of coffee and wearing the kind of gardening clothes that suggested she intended to help whether I asked or not. "Lilacs," she said, examining the plants with approval. "My grandmother always said they were the most hopeful flowers, ugly sticks most of the year, then absolutely glorious for 2 weeks in spring." We spent the morning digging holes, amending soil, and settling the small plants into their new homes. The work was satisfying in ways that reminded me of my early teaching years, when shaping young minds felt like the most important work in the world. These bushes would outlive me, I realized, their spring blooms feeding bees and neighbors long after I was gone. "You know what I love about gardening?" Elena said as we watered the newly planted bushes. "It's one of the few activities that requires you to think both short-term and long-term simultaneously. You're planning for next month's watering schedule and next decade's mature growth at the same time." The observation felt like a metaphor for everything I'd been learning about building a sustainable life. The daily work of baking, the weekly rhythm of markets, the long-term security of charitable trusts, all of it required attention to immediate needs and distant possibilities. That afternoon, as I stood at my kitchen window looking out at the small lilac forest I'd created, I realized I was already imagining next spring's blooms. For the first time in years, I was planning a future that belonged entirely to me. The call from Sarah came 3 days later, while I was experimenting with a new recipe for cranberry orange bread that Rosa had requested for the holidays. "Mom," she said, and something in her tone was different, softer, less certain than the demanding voice I'd grown accustomed to. "Could we have lunch this week? Just the 2 of us?" We met at a small cafe downtown, neutral territory that felt safer than either of our homes. Sarah arrived a few minutes after me, looking uncharacteristically nervous as she scanned the room and located my corner table. "You look good," she said as she sat down, and I realized she was right. The past month of purposeful work and meaningful activity had changed something in my posture, my energy, and my presence in the world. We ordered soup and sandwiches, making careful small talk about the weather and her work until our food arrived and conversation could no longer be postponed. "I've been thinking about what David said," Sarah began, stirring her soup without eating it. "About how we got comfortable with your help. And I realized. I can't remember the last time I asked how you were doing. Really asked, not just passing conversation." The admission hung between us, creating space for honesty we hadn't shared in years. "I think I've been afraid," she continued, "that if I really paid attention to your life, I'd have to acknowledge how much we've been taking from you without giving back. It was easier to assume you were happy with the arrangements because you never complained." "I didn't know how to complain without sounding ungrateful," I said. "I wanted to be helpful, to be needed. But somewhere along the way, I forgot that being needed and being valued aren't the same thing." We talked for 2 hours, covering territory that felt both painful and necessary. Sarah told me about the pressure she'd felt as a working mother and how my availability had become a cornerstone of her ability to manage career and family. I told her about the gradual erosion of my sense of self, how helping had transformed from a choice into an obligation without either of us noticing the shift. "The dinner party," Sarah said finally, "was inexcusable. I was so focused on impressing David's colleagues that I forgot you were a person, not just help. I'm ashamed of that." The apology was genuine, accompanied by tears that told me she was beginning to understand the emotional cost of her family's assumptions about my availability. "What can we do differently?" she asked. "How do we build something better?" The question felt like an opening I'd been waiting for without knowing it existed. We spent the rest of our time together crafting agreements that would honor both her needs and my boundaries. Regular family dinners where I was a guest, not the caterer. Babysitting requests were made at least a week in advance, with genuine acceptance when I wasn't available. Financial emergencies are addressed through loans with clear repayment terms rather than gifts that create unspoken obligations. "I want Emma to see a different model," Sarah said as we prepared to leave. "I want her to understand that women don't have to disappear into service to the people they love." Walking to our cars, Sarah surprised me by asking about my business, my charitable foundation, and my plans for the future. Her questions showed genuine interest rather than the polite attention she'd previously given my activities. "I'm proud of you," she said before getting into her car. "For building something that's yours, for setting boundaries, for showing all of us what self-respect looks like." That evening, I celebrated with a simple dinner and a glass of wine, toasting the fragile beginning of what might become a healthier relationship with my daughter. Change, I was learning, required patience from all parties as new patterns replaced old assumptions. December arrived with the first snow and an order book fuller than I dared to hope. The holiday season had brought requests for custom cakes, cookie platters, and artisan breads that kept me baking from early morning until evening. But unlike the frantic holiday preparations of previous years, this work felt joyful because it was chosen rather than obligated. Rosa had featured my cranberry orange bread in the Coffee Corner's holiday promotion, leading to orders from 3 other local businesses. The farmers market had extended my season through December with a special holiday market that showcased local artisans. And word-of-mouth recommendations had generated more custom orders than I could fill, forcing me to start a waiting list for January. But the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. The Downtown Community Kitchen, recipient of the Lilac Trust's first grant, had asked me to cater their volunteer appreciation dinner. Standing in their industrial kitchen, preparing food that would feed people who spent their days feeding others, felt like the completion of some essential circle. "You've created something beautiful here," said Maria Santos, the kitchen's director, as we surveyed platters of herb-crusted chicken and rosemary focaccia ready for service. "This food has the kind of care in it that makes people feel valued, not just fed." The volunteers who gathered that evening included teachers and retirees, business owners and college students, and people from every neighborhood and economic level who had found common ground in service to their community. Watching them enjoy food I'd prepared while sharing stories of the people they'd served felt like the most important catering job I'd ever accepted. Elena had volunteered to help me serve, and as we moved through the room refilling platters and clearing tables, I realized I was seeing my future. Not the isolated retirement I'd been drifting toward, but a life interwoven with community in ways that honored both service and self-respect. "This is what it looks like," Elena said as we cleaned up after the dinner, "when you feed your own values instead of everyone else's expectations." That night, I sat at my kitchen table writing thank you notes to the volunteers, thinking about the year that was ending and the one that would soon begin. 12 months ago, I had been a woman defined primarily by her availability to others. Now I was a business owner, a philanthropist, a neighbor, and a baker whose work brought joy to others while sustaining her own sense of purpose. The transformation hadn't been dramatic or sudden. It had emerged from a series of small choices: the decision to leave a dinner party with my dignity intact, the courage to revise financial documents, and the willingness to try something new with my hands and heart. Each choice had built upon the others, creating momentum that carried me toward a life I'd never planned but finally recognized as my own. On New Year's morning, I stood in my kitchen making bread for one and tea for two. Elena would arrive soon for our traditional first day of the year breakfast. The house smelled of yeast and possibility, winter sunlight streaming through windows that framed my small lilac forest, dormant now but full of spring's promise. The phone rang as I was pulling the loaf from the oven, and Sarah's name appeared on the caller ID. But instead of the anxious response such calls had once triggered, I felt simple curiosity about what my daughter might need or want to share. "Happy New Year, Mom," she said, her voice carrying warmth that had been missing for too long. "I wanted to thank you." "For what?" "For showing me that it's never too late to choose yourself. For teaching Emma what self-respect looks like. For proving that love doesn't have to taste like servitude." The words echoed conversations we'd been having over the past months, the slow reconstruction of a relationship that honored both connection and independence. It wasn't the relationship we'd had before. That dynamic had been unsustainable and ultimately harmful to both of us. But it was the relationship we were building together, one conversation and one boundary at a time. "I made something for you," Sarah continued. "A photo album of all the family pictures that show you cooking, baking, and feeding us over the years. But I wrote new captions for them. Instead of Mom making dinner or Grandma's cookies, they say things like Margaret sharing her artistry and the baker at work." The gift was so thoughtful, so precisely what I needed to reclaim those years of unacknowledged labor as expressions of love rather than obligations, that I had to sit down. "I'll bring it by this afternoon, if that works," Sarah said. "And I'd love to buy some of your bread for Sunday dinner. We're hosting David's parents, and I want to serve something special." Hosting. Buying bread rather than expecting it. Small words that carried the weight of transformed understanding. After hanging up, I stood at my kitchen window, looking out at the snow-covered garden where lilac bushes waited for spring's awakening. In a few months, they would bloom in colors I could only imagine, filling my yard with fragrance that would drift over the fence to neighbors who would smile at the unexpected gift of beauty. Elena's car pulled into my driveway as I was setting the table for our breakfast. She emerged carrying a covered dish and wearing the kind of smile that suggested good news. "I brought quiche," she called as she approached my front door. "And I have something to tell you." Over breakfast, she shared her news. The pottery studio where she'd been taking classes had asked her to teach a beginner's workshop, recognizing her natural ability and patience with struggling students. At 71, she would be starting a second career in artistic instruction. "You inspired me," she said simply. "Watching you build something entirely new showed me that retirement doesn't have to mean retirement from purpose." We spent the morning sharing dreams for the year ahead. Elena's teaching plans, my ideas for expanding the baking business, and the charitable projects we might undertake together. We were two women in our 70s, planning futures that belonged to us rather than being planned around other people's needs and expectations. "To second axe," Elena said, raising her teacup in a toast. "To second axe," I agreed, "and to the courage to choose ourselves." Outside my kitchen window, snow began to fall again, dusting the lilac bushes with white that would melt and nourish their roots. By spring, they would be ready for their first bloom, filling my yard with color I had planted but never seen. I thought about the roast I had carried out of my daughter's house 3 months ago, the moment when I had finally chosen dignity over accommodation. That single act of self-respect had led to everything that followed: the financial boundaries, the business, the charitable trust, and the restored relationships built on mutual respect rather than assumed obligation. I had taken my roast back home, and there, it had fed me in ways I never expected. Not just the meat itself, but the satisfaction of honoring my own worth, the nourishment that comes from choosing myself when choosing myself feels impossible. The afternoon light was fading when I finally sat down with my journal, recording the events and realizations of a year that had reshaped my understanding of love, service, and self-respect. At the bottom of the page, I wrote a line that seemed to capture everything I'd learned. Repair begins where revenge would have started and grows into something neither anger nor accommodation could have created. Outside, the snow continued falling on my lilac forest, on my neighbors' houses, and on the community I had chosen to serve in ways that honored both their needs and my own dignity. Tomorrow I would bake bread for customers who valued my artistry, tend relationships that nourished rather than depleted me, and continue building a life that fed my soul as surely as my work fed others. I had taken my roast back home, and in doing so, I had taken myself back too.